The governments of the nearly 200 different independent states found around the world today range from democratic, where tremendous personal freedom exists, to authoritarian, where freedom is rare or non-existent. In a democratic political system, the government's authority to make public policies comes from the people. In a democratic country, one of the most important purposes of the government is to protect individual rights. As a result, democratic systems are generally designed to place strict limits on governmental powers. They often closely follow written constitutions that set rules for how the government functions. In democratic systems, government officials are chosen via free, fair, multi-party elections, in which the rights to vote and hold office are granted to essentially all adult citizens, regardless of race, gender, class, or religion. In democratic systems, civil liberties such as the freedoms of speech, press, and religion are protected from government actions. And power is generally separated between different branches of government, each of which is regulated by a closely followed system of checks and balances. On the other end of the spectrum of government are authoritarian political systems. Throughout the world, governments of different states fall somewhere between the two extremes of fully democratic or completely authoritarian. Many authoritarian states have a few democratic features, but do not meet all of the typical democratic criteria. Generally, in an authoritarian state, the government is able to control both the public and private lives of its people. It can make public policies without regard for their civil liberties. In many authoritarian states, the government is controlled by a single person or a small group of elites that exercise unlimited power over those they rule. Authoritarian leaders often come from very specific segments of the population. For example, they might be high-ranking military officials or members of wealthy, powerful families. So while democratic governments receive their power to govern from the people themselves, power in authoritarian governments come from other sources, such as their leader's family lineage or by force. Authoritarian leaders in many countries conduct rigged or single-party elections that they can then use to claim their legitimacy to rule. Authoritarian governments come in many different forms. For example, in an absolute monarchy, the ruler has complete control over the government, and leadership is passed within a powerful family from one generation to the next. Absolute monarchies dominated society in Europe for centuries, but are rare in modern times. Today, Saudi Arabia is one of only 7 countries in the world ruled by an absolute monarch. Saudi Arabia has no political parties or national elections, so its people have little opportunity to influence political decision-making. Not all political systems with monarchs are ruled by authoritarian leaders. Today, in constitutional monarchies such as Great Britain, which lies at the democratic end of the spectrum, the monarchs act mainly as government figureheads and perform mostly ceremonial roles. And the operations of government are carried out mainly by democratically elected bodies, such as parliaments. Another form of authoritarian government, called an oligarchy, recently existed in the Southeast Asian country of Myanmar, also known as Burma. During the over 40 years that an oligarchy ruled this country, power was held by a small group called the Revolutionary Council, consisting of 18 unelected military officers who governed its citizens as they wished. So, an oligarchy is a form of government carried out by a very small, elite, all-powerful group of people. Many states in the world have been, or still are, dictatorships. A dictator is a single ruler who wields absolute authority over the people of a country. For example, in Cuba during the 1950s, This man, named Fulgencio Batista, was a dictator. He violently ruled the country, primarily in order to enrich himself and his powerful friends. Authoritarian dictators frequently gain control of a country through force or election fraud. They generally use fear tactics and impose strict punishments on anyone who expresses disloyalty to the government. Totalitarianism is an authoritarian political system in which the state exerts nearly total control over most aspects of the public and private lives of its citizens. In Cuba, a totalitarian government developed after the dictator Batista was brought down in 1959 by a popular revolution led by Fidel Castro. Castro eventually went on to set up and head a totalitarian system in which only one political party, the Communist Party of Cuba, was allowed a role in government. Under this system, the president, Fidel Castro, along with state committees and assemblies he usually headed, essentially controlled all of the government decision-making in Cuba. Castro defended the repressive machinery of his government that deprived Cubans of their basic rights by saying that the state must limit the freedoms of individuals and imprison those involved in counter-revolutionary activity in order to protect the rights of the overall population. After nearly 50 years in power, Fidel Castro stepped down, and his brother Raúl, who was the only person on the ballot, was elected Cuba's president. The People's Republic of China is another example of a totalitarian state based on having just one political party. In this case, it's the Chinese Communist Party. Currently, about 87 million Chinese are members of the party and can vote for their leaders. The other roughly 1.3 billion Chinese citizens are not allowed to either vote or run for office. Day-to-day life in an authoritarian state can be quite different from daily life in a fully democratic one. For example, freedom of speech is generally not permitted in authoritarian states. The government controls what appears in the newspapers, on the internet, and on television. Government censors eliminate any statements or photos, even humorous ones, that might be construed as being mocking or critical of it. Political protests and labor strikes are almost always suppressed in authoritarian states. In order to make certain their citizens are behaving properly, authoritarian regimes often closely monitor their actions. And elections, if they take place at all, are generally unfair. Perhaps only one candidate is listed on the ballot, or all the candidates belong to the ruling political party. Religious freedom can also be limited, and religious or ethnic minorities are generally not protected from discrimination. People living in authoritarian states often do not receive fair trials and tend to have little legal recourse when it comes to dealing with government and police corruption. Freedom of movement is often under strict control in highly authoritarian states as well. People are told where they must live and when they must move. And sometimes citizens are not allowed to travel freely outside or even within an authoritarian country.